With that down and out of the way, let's now move on to our second main topic today. Chris, what is our second main topic today?
We're hearing from Kevin W. Crutchfield. Saw a deadline that the long-awaited big screen adaptation of the RPG Dungeons & Dragons may be one step closer to happening, with the directing duo of Jonathan Goldstein and John Francis Daley are in talks to direct. After the train wreck that was Vacation and the train wreck that's become the Flash movie, do you think this may be the movie and the right guys to finally bring D&D to the big screen? Knowing what a big RPG campaign guy you are, John, would love to hear your thoughts. All right, so this movie is possibly going to happen. Do you feel good about these guys being on board? Do you feel good about the movie?
Well, I mean, look, first of all, I'm excited about anything Dungeons & Dragons related. You guys know I have a regular Sunday night Dungeons & Dragons game that I play in. I've been playing Dungeons & Dragons since I'm a kid. You know, D20 for life, all that kind of stuff. That said,
D20 for life?
D20 for life, my friend. D20 for life. All right. So here's the thing, though. Vacation, I agree, was a disaster. But then Francis and Goldstein, they wrote Spider-Man Homecoming, if I'm not mistaken, which I thought was a terrific script. I actually thought it was a really good story. And then they directed Game Night.
Yes.
And I loved Game Night. I thought that was probably the best pure comedy, just a straight up comedy. I thought it might have been the best straight up comedy that year. I really thought it was wonderful. Now, here's the funny thing. They were announced to be directing Flash before Game Night came out. And at that time, all we had was, okay, they wrote the script for Homecoming, all right, but Vacation, man, that was not good. And they directed that, and I'm nervous. But then I saw Game Night. I'm like, okay, you know what? I really love what they did with this. I think they could do a great job with the Flash, and then the Flash fell apart. Now, you mentioned in your message the disaster that was the Flash. Let's be clear here. The Flash was a disaster long before they were ever brought on board. And it continues to be a disaster now that they're not there. Then the whole Ezra Miller nonsense, they went through 3 or 4 sets of writers, 2 or 3 sets of different directors. Then they were on probably the longest, and then they departed because they couldn't get together creatively with the studio. All that. So The Flash was a disaster before it ever happened. Now, for those of you who are wondering now what's going on, what's this stuff going on between these guys and D&D, here's the report that we have from our friends over at Slash Film. Jonathan Goldstein and John Francis Daley already directed one movie centered around games, and now they're going to take a chance on another. The Game Night filmmakers have been summoned by Paramount. Again, they use the word summoned. Again. Summoned by Paramount to direct the Dungeons & Dragons movie. Goldstein and Daley were previously attached to direct The Flash for Warner Brothers, but recently exited the project. Now, they have their eyes set on a film adaptation of the fantasy role-playing game. And I'll tell you what, Rob, you know, after seeing Game Night, I came much more around on the idea of these guys. It helped me appreciate a little bit more of the script work they did in the Spider-Man film. And I was starting to look forward to them directing the Flash movie. I'm totally down with the Dungeons & Dragons movie. Now, they've tried it once, they tried it once before, and it was an unmitigated disaster. The one with Jeremy Irons. Terrible, terrible, terrible film. And this new one could be a bad idea too. But I will admit, because of my bias, I am excited for them to get on this and to see an actual D&D movie. You're hearing about this situation. What do you make of it?
Well, you know, I too grew up playing Dungeons & Dragons and Traveler. Those are the 2 games that I played, role-playing games that I played growing up. And, like, I love the Mattel and Television Dungeons & Dragons, which I thought was great.
I remember that. That's right.
I loved it.
Wait, did Mattel make in Television?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't
Mattel Electronics was in Television, yeah.
I didn't realize that.
I don't know if they made that game. It might have been an Activision game, but I loved in Television. But here's the thing. Dungeons & Dragons is made up of tropes from other things, like other fantasy stories, even Tolkien. You know,
yeah, very much.
There's a lot of stuff. So what's your story? There's not like, and I thought the same problem, Warcraft had the same problem. Warcraft is this rich world that's an amalgamation of all of these different fantasy tropes that go all the way back into history and with people like Tolkien. So when you're going to make a movie, what's your story? You end up having to tell sort of a generic fantasy story that seems totally sort of, well, generic. Evil wizards, dragons, orcs, you know, whatever. And when we live in a world where we got the Lord of the Rings trilogy, we have Game of Thrones, we have a lot of this great fantasy material that's being, you know, writ large on the big and small screens, how do you make a Dungeons and Dragons movie and have it stand out and be as good, if not better, than what we saw already? How do we do that?
I think you're looking at it the wrong way, to be honest with you, because I agree with you 100% that, you know, when you approach something like a Dungeons and Dragons, there's not a pre-told story there, right? But I see it as an incredible opportunity because it's a blank slate. It's a blank page. That you're given this world, you're given a context you can tell a story in, but now you can almost step in there and tell any story that you want.
But that's the problem. What story do you tell?
But I think that's an incredible opportunity. I think that's a great opportunity because you can tell any story you like. If you can come up with a compelling story with compelling heroes, compelling villains, magic and wonder and all that kind of stuff, you're not confined or handcuffed by some pre-existing narrative path. You actually can do anything you want in there. Now, I don't know if maybe they kind of pull a little bit of a Jumanji and say, this is going to start with a bunch of dudes who gather together every Thursday night and play D&D, and then it takes us into the game and we see the game they're playing out. Maybe they just go pure. It's just pure from the start. We're in that world, and that's the world it takes place in. It gives them the opportunity to write whatever kind of movie they want and come up with any kind of story they want and put it within the context of a Dungeons and Dragons world. And to me, that's exciting. I think that's, I don't see, so I see that as an advantage, actually. I don't see that as a limitation. Because I think, you know, when you look at a lot of video game movies, that's been one of the downfalls of a lot of video game movies. A lot of video game movie creators have felt constrained and hand-tied to whatever maybe the narrative of the game was, and that's kind of what we got to do. And, you know, they're basically, video game movies are 1 for 50 at this point. Maybe
Right.
1 for 50. You know, if you want to, I count Tomb Raider as the one actually pretty good video game movie ever made. But yeah, I see it as a little bit of an advantage myself.
See, I just think that you're locked into generic fantasy movie mode. Like, what story are you going to tell? And even with a video game, other than Warcraft, which is, again, the same problem with Dungeons and Dragons, there's this open world. What are you going to do? How do you make this different than how do you make it better than Game of Thrones? Or how do you make it better than Lord of the Rings?
But that's like saying a crime movie? How do you make it better than The Godfather? Well, I mean, is that the only thing?
But the thing about this is almost like Dungeons and Dragons is almost like generic science fiction movie. It's generic sword and sorcery movie.
Only if they make it that way. See, because I would turn that around on you, Rob, and say, if they said they were making a movie based in, 2019 New York, there's already lots of movies based on today's New York. What are you going to do? Just a generic 2019
I would ask you
New York?
then, as a
it's
fan,
just a context.
But as a fan, what would you like to see a Dungeons and Dragons movie be?
Oh,
if you got to come up with one.
Nothing. Oh, if I came up with
Yeah.
one? Oh, no idea. No idea. That's why. But that's the same thing when people say, John, what do you want to see in the new Star Wars movie? I don't care. I want to leave that up to the storytellers to tell me their story. I'm just excited to see whatever story they're going to bring. And I think, you could make a Dungeons and Dragons movie pure action. You could make it intrigue. You could make it a mystery. You could make it you could make it a political thriller if you wanted to, really. I mean, that's what I love. All it is the blank page of a context. And you can go, but I don't know, maybe you're right. Maybe there's going to be some sort of a temptation just to fall into a more generic trope of sword and sorcery kind of thing. I'm sure that's going to be a possible drawback too. Chris, you're hearing about all this. Do you get excited about the notion of a D&D movie? Or like some people, you're like, come on, a D&D movie? Like, where are you falling on this?
I'm really excited about this. I've played some 5th edition. Let's do this. I think what's really interesting here is that, for me, the things that you have to hit if you're being confined to saying it's a D&D inspired film is that you're mostly hitting the archetypes of the players, right?
Right.
So you need to have, your mage, your rogue, some cast assembled, some little team formed. But as far as the story going tells, that can go anywhere. And like any good D&D campaign, what really works is specificity in your quest, and then incredibly interesting choices to that, to what you're having happen in the game, right? So it gives you a lot of room to experiment and do things that are against the tropes. If you do have something that's very Lord of the Rings, Tolkien-esque, then how are you going to turn that on its head and make it interesting? Because the thing I like about D&D is when somebody makes an off-the-wall choice, and then your DM gives them that Benny at the end and is like, that was crazy. No one saw that coming. coming. I didn't even know. You gave me so much to think about for next week's session. So I think it gives people a lot of room to really experiment with, a fantasy genre and have fun with it.
And I think at the heart of it, like, we all love to experiment. That could have gone the wrong way.
New t-shirt.
New t-shirt. We all love to experiment. Winky face. But no, and I think you're right. It gives them the freedom. To Rob's point, though, it will depend on if they go into it with the attitude of, let's really get creative here. Let's do something because we have no restraints here. Let's do something creative. Or, as Rob is fearing, they could fall into, well, we kind of feel the pressure just to have a sorcerer, a ranger, a dwarf going after the evil orc king. And if they do leave it at that, there is the danger of that. And I think Rob has a point there with that as well. It'll all be about what do they decide to do. And I hope they decide to go balls to the wall and get a little bit creative. Anyway, guys, what do you think about this news about the game night? And at one time, we're going to be the Flash directors now taking on a Dungeons and Dragons movie. Are you excited about it? Do you think it's a little bit too little, too late? Or are you just excited about the idea of experimenting? Jump down into the comments section below and let us know your thoughts. All right.